think we'll get started, and I think Kabir's presentation will dovetail very nicely into this because I'm basically talking about the service economy and the outsourcing or peripheralization of it through digital labor platforms. And I also will focus a little bit on South Asia, and you'll see why that's so relevant. So my name is Zachary Sedefian. I'm a master's student at the Department of Political Science at Brooklyn College, CUNY. I'm a software engineer by training, with experiences working at Ford and NBC Universal, building like cloud distributed systems. And my interest in global labor arbitrage, the process in which capital basically seeks the cheapest labor through outsourcing and offshoring and migration, my interest in that began when a CFO basically told me directly that he preferred hiring Colombian engineers because they cost 1/6 of my rate, and also he didn't have to pay them benefits. So that conversation combined with the post-COVID wave of tech layoffs led me to pursue the master's that I complete this May, and presenting some of the research that I performed under this title. So one concern of this research is resisting misinterpretations of digital transformations of global capitalism that have resulted in proclamations that capitalism has somehow died or transformed into a new mode of production. It's common to mistake the monopolistic tendencies of tech giants for feudal relations or the commodification of human activity into behavioral data as a departure from the law of value. But what we're witnessing is not a mutation of capitalism or its transcendence, but rather a new expression of the same exploitative structures that are intrinsic to the capitalist mode of production and the expansionist logic of accumulation that we know as imperialism. So my talk will highlight these principles and the key principles of radical political economics to talk about the centrality of surplus labor exploitation to make that case. And even though now we're witnessing a particularly violent moment of imperialist aggression, the digital platform economy may seem like a bit of an esoteric topic, but it's actually a central means of this imperialist domination, especially with the rise of AI-enabled warfare and counterinsurgency tactics like mass surveillance. AI requires vast amounts of labor input, an overwhelming majority of which comes from the global south, who basically sanitize and process raw data, translate audio recordings, and even design the algorithms and software for AI systems. The people who do this work are often contracted through what we call online labor platforms. But before we look closely at platforms, we need a little bit of historical and theoretical background. Maybe you guys don't, but I will go over this very briefly anyway. So in his 1845 study, The Condition of the Working Class of England, Friedrich Engels described England as a great manufacturing center of an agricultural world, with an ever-increasing number of corn and cotton-growing Irelands revolving around her, the industrial sun. Engels was describing a capitalist world system at a time when it was primarily characterized by the colonial policies of direct territorial rule, forced labor regimes, and ethnic cleansing that enabled industrial concentration in a small number of European countries. This bifurcation of the world into an agricultural periphery and a manufacturing center has since changed. In the neoliberal period, through outsourcing and offshoring, select peripheral countries have undergone an industrialization process, while the rest of the third world has been dropped into deeper levels of underdevelopment and poverty. This new international division of labor relocated industry from the global north to the previously colonized regions of the global south in search of cheap labor, while the northern economy shifted towards high value added services like downstream processing and marketing, design, and IT. And today, 70% of all economic activity in OECD countries consists of services like these, while parts of the global south have been configured, extending Engels' metaphor into a constellation of industrial satellites, producing cheap consumer goods to maintain an imperial mode of living in a northern core. Since the mid-2000s, online labor platforms like Freelancer and Upwork have extended the logic of the new international division of labor into digital labor markets, enabling firms to outsource tasks without the capital expenditure of foreign direct investment and without the need for physical migration. Demand for platform labor exploded in 2015, driven in part by the need to train AI models. A consistent feature of historical capitalism across these periods is, as Marx maintained, a surplus population of unemployed and precarious workers as a necessary feature of capitalist profit maintenance, what he called the reserve army of labor. Not only does the disciplining effect of unemployment push down the wages of active workers, but the very existence of the reserve enables capital to instantly mobilize inactive workers for production when expansion is needed. Utsa and Pravat Patnaik's conception of two reserve armies, one metropolitan and one peripheral, is particularly instructive when looking at online labor platforms. Historically, capitalism has used these two reserves for different functions, with the metropolitan reserve serving to discipline the wages of the northern workers, and the peripheral reserve basically enforcing a price-taking behavior of southern producers who are unable to defend their real incomes against metropolitan demand. One group can rely on social welfare states in times of distress and the other cannot, so there's something fundamentally different there. Not necessarily a global reserve army of labor, as some people say. And the geographic mobility of peripheral workers must remain politically restrained, otherwise they could migrate to advanced economies where their labor demands a higher wage, although often unequal due to discrimination. But the geographic mobility of capital has to remain perfectly unrestrained and move globally to any place where they can find the cheapest production cost, basically. And this was the view underlying Argeri Emanuel's critique of Ricardo's model of comparative advantage, which is widely accepted by mainstream economists today. I don't think I need to explain Ricardo to you guys, but basically, he said basically if your country specializes in its best commodity or best terms of trade commodity, then international trade will produce a harmonious world economy. Historical capitalism, of course, has been marked by uneven development, exactly as a result of that specialization, where certain countries are turned into monocultures or industrial export zones that then disarticulate those economies from the needs of the local regions. So the theoretical problem was that Ricardo assumed that both capital and labor were perfectly mobile on a world scale, but Emanuel observed that no, it's actually much more restrictive. You need to restrain labor to the peripheral zones to basically enforce that price-taking behavior. So let's talk about online labor platforms now. The World Bank estimates there's between 154 and 435 million online labor platforms workers globally, which is about 4 to 12% of the world's labor force, the low end of which is roughly equivalent to the number of migrant workers. So it's not so, such a peripheral of a topic, to use that term. So this figure shows like what kind of platform they work in. So freelancing with 64%, that's like high skill IT work, software engineering, accounting even, translation, stuff like that. And then micro task work. This is basically like tiny 1 second or maybe 5 second 1 cent tasks where they classify images or sanitize data or transcribe fragments of audio. And both of these tasks are fundamental to AI development. And a majority of platform workers hold advanced degrees, a bachelor degree or above. And one study showed that Indian workers actually have over 95% of them have bachelor's degrees or above. So these workers are just as qualified as workers in the north who make much higher wages for the same work, as we'll see momentarily. So on the left, data from Online Labor Index at Oxford shows that India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh now account for half of all registered freelancers. Between 2017 and 2024, shares from countries like Indonesia and Vietnam and Venezuela exploded, basically implying there's active recruitments by platforms in these countries. What's also interesting is that in the same period, I don't show this here, but in the same period, the US and the UK dropped from respectively 9 to 4% for the US and 7 to 2% for the UK, showing a clear preference for Southern labor. Meanwhile, the right graph shows that the United States accounts for over 40% of the contracts on platforms globally, and high-income countries will account for 3/4 of it. But it could be even larger because we're not really able to tell if the India, Pakistan, and Philippines, if those are subcontractors for northern demand or what exactly it is, just because of the methodological gaps. Now to look at wages, so this was one study that looked at two of the biggest platforms. So Upwork is one of the biggest freelancer platforms, and Amazon Mechanical Turk is one of the biggest microtask platforms. So we see that obviously we have wage discrepancies internationally, even though the same sort of work is being done. And it's kind of interesting here talking about, again, like the labor aristocracy and stuff like that. There's more convergence on microtask work than in standard, IT work. It's kind of interesting. And then globally, UNCTAD found that across 5 of the biggest platforms, wages were consistently sub-minimum, and international wage differences were stark, again, for the same exact work. And these findings, they basically justify, challenge a key justification of neoliberal economists who basically say, well, there's a difference in productivity levels, and that's why they get paid differently. So about the platform labor process. So the extreme wage gap on OLPs between geographic regions is the primary indicator of super exploitation, or a so-called third form of surplus value extraction identified by Hoy Marini to add to the Marxian classical versions of basically extending the working day or increasing labor intensity as absolute surplus value, or by increasing productivity with better technology, relative surplus value. So while capital, the imperial core, typically relies on technological productivity gains that increase relative surplus value, in the periphery it resorts to super exploitation, which involves the systemic oppression or suppression of wages below the value of labor power. And all forms of these super exploitations are intensified by online labor platforms, basically because of the massive competition from that digital reserve army I just discussed. Wages face massive downward pressure, with the average being 250, as we just saw from UNCTAD, combined with the fact that being independent contractors, they have to basically maintain their profiles, search for jobs, and that takes 16 hours a week. So, and that's not accounted for in the UNCTAD data, although it was accounted for in the first data that I showed you. There's all of this unpaid work that they're having to do, which is, takes up a good part of their time. On top of that, there's these new algorithmic management techniques. They don't even have a human really managing you. It's just about kind of it's a gamification of kind of how many contracts you completed in X amount of time, how, your ratings and all this stuff. And then there's leaderboards, basically, where you're asked to compete against other workers. Not to mention that even when you're applying or putting in a bid for a listing, you see all of the other bids. So, you're immediately, you're pressured to bring your wages down to go under the other bids. And then also while they're being surveilled by these algorithmic management systems, it's all being collated and then sold to basically surveillance and marketing companies. So they're really making a lot of profit on the workers. They have no legal protections, obviously. They can't sue the online labor platforms. Under US law, they cannot sue them. I think it's the Alien Tort Statute. And it's not like they're sending them like in US when you work at an IT job, they give you a laptop and all that. No, you have to bring all that yourself. You have to pay for your own electricity, pay for your own office, all of this stuff. So all of these mechanisms of surplus value exploitation are very prevalent. But the World Bank in 2015, when they wanted to kind of estimate the outlook for this, they wrote this paper that said the global opportunity in online outsourcing. And they said, well, online outsourcing offers a lot of benefits, not only monetary, but also a flexible working schedule, where you can take better care of your families and start your own business, and you can earn a good salary, and it also provides opportunity for on-the-job learning and skills development. Well, what we just saw was that, there's a brain drain actually happening. They're trained by Indian, let's say if we're talking about India or South Asia, they're trained by Indian universities that are paid for by Indian people, and then basically the skills that are invested in that worker get transferred abroad into northern products for northern consumption. On top of that, it's more of a minor thing, but time zone arbitrage, they're saying it's flexible, but actually you have to be online during US hours. So it's like people are destroying their health and life rhythms to basically get these jobs. So OLPs in reality actually they continue to super exploit labor along the periphery of the world system by paying wages under the value of labor power, They contribute to the entrenchment of international wage gaps and underdevelopment, and they block local development by exporting highly skilled labor to advanced economies who use this labor in technologies like AI weaponry and surveillance that are now central to political, militaristic, and even ideological domination. In fact, the Wall Street Journal reported the use of Anthropic's Claude AI model in the kidnapping of Venezuelan President Maduro, and according to CBS, in the US strikes in Iran, including on the girls' school that killed and wounded hundreds. This comes also as a Pentagon memo states it will adopt Palantir AI as a core US military system. In the fourth case, researchers at the Pulitzer Center found that Somali gig workers in a refugee camp in Kenya were hired by a US Air Force contractor called Scale AI to translate recordings of Somali conversations and what appeared to be private communications in text message. This processed data was then used to train one of the world's most advanced surveillance aircrafts, the Rivet Joint. So here we see a feedback loop of imperialist violence where people who are displaced from their homes by US military intervention, only to be put into refugee camps, are then incorporated into an economy that ensures their continued domination. This, not so much. This is DeepSeek might be one of the good ones, but it's not as good technically, unfortunately. But when they're doing this work, it's basically unrecognized by the workers themselves until, some of them were saying like, this feels weird because this sounds like just a conversation some guy is having in a supermarket or something. Why am I translating this? So my study demonstrates that online labor platforms exacerbate uneven development in the global economy and provide what I call a virtual mobility fix for capital to access skilled labor, while also eliminating the need for migration or foreign direct investment, as I mentioned. So online labor platforms in that way are thus perfectly matched for the post-neoliberal era of protectionism characterized by increasingly militarized borders, securitized visa regimes, and anti-immigrant ideologies. As the movement of workers becomes increasingly politically constrained, platforms are an attractive alternative to direct forms of global labor arbitrage. Unlike industrial relocation, platforms transfer no physical productive asset to the periphery. Infrastructure, data, technological control remain concentrated in the global north, making meaningful technological transfer impossible under these conditions. I already mentioned the legal barriers. So these findings to me, they point towards a strategic horizon that is consistent with delinking traditions, because as we can, if you noticed, where's China here? Isn't it funny that China is not in the top 20 of the workers, but if you look at manufacturing, it's like 30% of US manufacturing or something. Well, China developed their own digital labor platform. They developed their own digital economy. And they did that first by delinking and then, through integration. So they have their own platforms like Jubaijie and Boss Chip In and stuff like this that let the country basically retain the value of their highly trained workers nationally. So investigation is needed on that front to figure out under which conditions cooperative public or even regional platforms can emerge in the global south, and especially South Asia. And another line of inquiry of research would be to actually figure out the class character of that digital reserve army, and basically to figure out where we're at today with the concept of the labor aristocracy. So both lines of inquiry that I just described, they're essential for identifying pathways out of this digital era, unequal exchange and uneven development, and for weakening the structures of imperialist hegemony that have organized global social relations for the past 5 centuries.